Imagine a courtroom trial of a serial killer. Just a year ago, within 15 minutes, he raped and strangled 2 girls and brutally injured 2 others. It's likely these were neither his first nor his last victims. The verdict is obvious: the death penalty. But after the judgment, something strange happens. The judge calls the defendant over and gives a heartfelt speech, almost regretting having to punish such a pleasant guy. He even says, "Take care, young man," several times.
But you're a bright young man. You made a good lawyer. I'd love to have you practice in front of me, but you went another way, partner. Take care of yourself.
Sounds like a plot from a cheap TV show, right? Too staged to be real. But that's exactly what happened, and that pleasant guy was Theodore Robert Bundy, also known as Ted Bundy. A sadist who took the lives of at least 30 young women, Bundy indeed knew how to make an impression. It's no wonder he's called the most charming serial killer, always well-dressed, smiling, and able to carry a conversation effortlessly. But behind this facade was a true beast, devoid of any compassion. Bundy committed his murders during a time when America was reeling from violence, sexual revolution, and the fragmentation of its social fabric. News reports of bloody crimes were interspersed with stories of the fight for equality and hippie protests. All this mixed with political scandals and seismic shifts in American society. There's a common belief that Ted Bundy didn't fit the profile of a typical maniac. Was he really so adept at manipulating people that no one suspected him for years? How did a promising law student turn into a monstrous killer and rapist? And how did this maniac nearly become a well-known American politician? Today, I won't be telling this story alone. Joining me is my co-narrator, Alex, bringing his own perspective to the haunting story of Ted Bundy. Serial Files is a series where we explore the most terrifying killers and criminals through the lens of history, culture, and politics. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and let's dive into the story of the attractive and repulsive Ted Bundy, the hero of our first episode of Serial Files.
On February 1st, 1974, residents of Seattle in the northwest of America were left without a weather forecast. The radio presenter who usually gave the weather report did not come to work. She was only 21 years old and was studying at the psychology department of the University of Washington. She disappeared from her dorm room overnight, leaving only a bloodstain on the mattress. Police immediately suspected kidnapping, especially since another student had been attacked a few blocks from her home not long before. The girl's skull was fractured, and she was brutally raped. She spent over a week in a coma and survived by a miracle. Soon, students began disappearing in other cities in Washington state and neighboring Oregon, often from university campuses. Some disappeared after a night out at a local bar, an evening walk, or a library study session. One girl was last seen leaving her dormitory, needing to walk just 30 meters down a well-lit alley. This wasn't the dark, foggy alleys of Jack the Ripper's East End with one gas lamp per block. But during a short walk, something happened, and she seemed to vanish into thin air. By the summer of 1974, authorities confirmed the disappearance of 6 students. The story was actively picked up by journalists. A common victim profile emerged: young, slim, attractive, white female students with long hair parted in the middle. However, the police were not quick to connect all the cases. They seemed to lack significant leads, but they did have important witness statements. In at least 3 episodes, a man with a bandaged arm or on crutches was seen near the places where the girls disappeared. This man approached girls on the street, asking for help carrying a stack of books or a suitcase to his car. The description of the man's vehicle matched in all cases: a beige Volkswagen Beetle, a small, almost toy-like 3-door car that was a bestseller at the time. The Beetle had become popular among fashionable Americans a few years earlier. Some versions even came with a portable coffee maker mounted on the dashboard. The culmination of events in the Northwest came with the disappearance of 2 girls near Lake Sammamish. Both disappeared within a few hours in broad daylight at a crowded beach. Again, a man in a Beetle with a bandaged arm was spotted. Other girls at the beach recalled a man asking them to help load a sailboat onto his car. One even agreed and went with him, only to be told they needed to drive to his parents' house first. Other witnesses saw the missing girls leave with this man, who introduced himself as Ted. So, the police had testimonies about a Ted driving a fashionable Beetle, behaving suspiciously, and appearing in almost all the disappearance cases. The name was likely fake. What maniac would use his real name? But it was worth checking out. At that time, there were 42,000 Beetles in Washington state, with about 100 Teds among the owners. At least the police could create a composite sketch, which was printed in newspapers and shown on TV. You see it on the screen now. Honestly, it only vaguely resembles our anti-hero, but it was enough for several people to recognize the 28-year-old Ted Bundy. His appearance, the car, and the connection to the University of Washington, which Bundy had graduated from a few years before the student disappearances, were all strong matches. This could have ended the story of one of America's most infamous maniacs, but the police didn't even bother to interrogate him. The reason was banal. There was no solid evidence. The police could have dug deeper, but they were deterred by Bundy's clean-cut appearance and background. He didn't fit the image of a brutal rapist and killer. He wasn't Charles Manson, who everyone knew looked the part of a deranged cult leader. Bundy was his complete antithesis. No criminal record, presentable appearance, 6 feet tall, a respectable lawyer with a background working for the governor and state agencies. Even those who recognized Bundy in the composite sketch found it hard to believe he could be involved in the disappearances. Among them was Elizabeth Klupfer, a single mother who had been dating Bundy for 5 years. Although she already suspected Ted wasn't the upstanding guy he appeared to be, he frequently stole clothes and household items, and she regularly found suspicious objects in his belongings, including plaster casts, knives, clearly not for the kitchen, and a bag of women's clothes. She dismissed it as coincidence. Ironically, when rumors about a maniac named Ted started circulating, Bundy advised her to check the back door more often, just in case. A psychology professor who had taught Bundy also recognized him from the sketch. Before studying law, Bundy had earned a bachelor's degree from the University of Washington. The professor couldn't believe one of his best students was capable of such atrocities. Bundy was always neat, attentive, and polite, standing out among the rebellious students.
Today, American university campuses are known as hotbeds of social movements. Radical groups stage protests, and activists are often ideologically polarized. This isn't new. It's been this way for the last 60 years. Following the events in Europe, U.S. university campuses became centers of protest in the 1960s. Students marched for free speech, women's rights, civil rights, and against the Vietnam War. The older generation also viewed rebellious students with disdain. In 1970, when Bundy enrolled in the University of Washington's psychology department, the country was engulfed in a massive student strike. The trigger was the U.S. invasion of Cambodia, a neighboring country to Vietnam. President Nixon's administration wanted to save a friendly regime that supported the U.S. in its fight against the North Vietnamese army. This military operation is considered a turning point in the war in the region. The strike began on May 1st under anti-war slogans, but just 3 days later, police opened fire on a peaceful student march in Ohio, killing 4 students. Among them was a girl named Krause, who is attributed with the phrase, "Flowers are better than bullets." The saying quickly became a popular anti-war slogan. The tragedy caused a huge international outcry, including in the Soviet Union. For example, Russian poet Yevgeny Yevtushenko wrote a poem titled, "Flowers Better Than Bullets," dedicated to the Ohio event. Don't give flowers to a state where truth is punished, a state that returns cynicism and cruelty as a gift. And your gift, Allison Krause, was a bullet that pushed out a flower. After the Kent State massacre, the strike escalated. 900 campuses, universities, colleges, and high schools across the country joined the action. The total number of protesters exceeded the staggering figure of 4 million. Bundy's university was no exception. In Seattle, radical students called police officers pigs and pelted them with stones. Clashes occurred in other educational institutions, prompting authorities to mobilize the National Guard in 16 states. Nixon's chief speechwriter described the events as a civil war. The protest culminated in a demonstration of 100,000 people near the White House. At one point, President Nixon himself came out to meet the protesters. He spent several hours with the activists, but couldn't reach an agreement. Later, Nixon called the protesters pawns of foreign communists and ordered the creation of a commission to combat dissent. The strike vividly demonstrated that the student movement had become a force to be reckoned with. Most distressing for the authorities was that these protests were not fringe movements. By then, the Vietnam War had been raging for over a decade, and both mature conservatives and left-leaning students were weary of it. Here's a social survey for reference. In 1966, only 1 in 4 Americans thought the U.S. involvement in that war was a mistake. But by 1970, 1 in 2 held that view. Ted Bundy wasn't throwing stones at police officers and condemned hooliganism, but that doesn't mean he wasn't interested in politics.
As a child, Bundy loved listening to politicians' speeches on the radio and then retelling them, mimicking their delivery. From a young age, Ted was fascinated by the idea of power and always wanted to seem more important than he was. Therefore, after graduating from high school, he went into politics. Throughout his brief political career, Bundy worked for the Republicans, although all his mentors were considered liberals by the party's standards. The first was Nelson Rockefeller, the leader of the moderate wing of the Republicans. As governor of New York, he legalized abortion and allowed women to work in the police force. In 1968, this scion of one of America's wealthiest families ran for president for the 3rd time. Bundy volunteered in Rockefeller's Seattle office, working as an office manager, answering calls, sorting documents, and training new volunteers. He was perfect for the role, neat, smiling, polite, and stylishly dressed. A colleague recalled seeing a future president in Bundy, a Kennedy prototype. Bundy's work for Rockefeller ended with a trip to the Republican convention in Miami, the culmination of the primary season. Rockefeller was competing with Nixon and the leader of the conservative wing, Ronald Reagan, then governor of California. Bundy thrived at the convention, actively networking, debating the country's future, and making connections, behaving like an aspiring politician. But Rockefeller lost the primaries, and the Republicans nominated Nixon, who later became president. Bundy was disappointed, but didn't leave politics. In 1968, 6 years before the Seattle murders, Bundy helped Arthur Fletcher, the first African-American to run for statewide office on the West Coast, campaign for lieutenant governor of Washington State. This story now sounds cinematic. Bundy worked for Fletcher as a driver and bodyguard, almost a plot from the movie Green Book. But the peak of Bundy's political career was his involvement in Governor Daniel Evans's campaign. Evans had led Washington State for over a decade and was one of the most popular American governors of the 20th century. Bundy performed delicate tasks for him, attending all the Democratic opponents' events, asking questions, and recording everything on tape for Evans to use in debates. Note that Bundy already had a knack for assuming different identities, and people believed him. He presented himself as a political science student and even altered his appearance, wearing fake mustaches and beards. By today's standards, Bundy's actions weren't criminal. But back then, the Watergate scandal was brewing, one of the biggest political crises in American history. If you want, we can make a separate video about it. Let us know in the comments. Several people connected to President Nixon's entourage were accused of trying to bug the Democratic headquarters during the election campaign. The scandal led to Nixon's impeachment and resignation. Watergate became a symbol of political deception, and everyone saw surveillance and conspiracies everywhere. Bundy wasn't planting bugs, but local Democrats tried to inflate a scandal when they learned that a student spying on them was on the competitor's payroll. They accused Republicans of espionage and attempted to discredit the candidate. Bundy was even compared to the Watergate figures, which likely flattered him. For the first time, journalists took an interest in him. He gave a few interviews, portraying himself as modest, saying his role in the elections shouldn't be overestimated. But he didn't rule out running for office someday. After the elections, Bundy became an assistant to the local Republican leader, who described him as smart, appropriately aggressive, and a believer in the system. It seemed Bundy could have had a brilliant career, possibly becoming a governor, senator, or going even further. But he chose a shorter path to fame. aided by the very politicians who helped launch his career.
After the campaign, the governor of Washington appointed Bundy to the District Crime Prevention Commission. Sounds like a bad joke, right? But wait, Bundy was assigned to work on the issues of rape and abduction of women, allowing him to study police methods. Local authorities essentially let the fox into the henhouse. One of Bundy's colleagues on the commission later compiled a psychological profile of a typical rapist. Imagine her shock when she found out the real killer had worked alongside her, not fitting her profile at all. Why did such commissions even exist back then? In the mid-60s, violent crimes in the U.S. were rising. In 1965, there were 200 of such cases per 100,000 people. By 1980, it was nearly 600. Rapes had tripled and murders had doubled. Society was shocked by the number of sex crimes. The media began constantly talking about maniacs. It was around the turn of the 80s that the term serial killer became popular. Initially used by specialists, it was soon adopted by the media. Historians and psychologists explain the rise in violence during this period differently. Some attribute it to the aftermath of World War II, with American veterans' trauma affecting their children who grew up in the 70s and started committing violence themselves. This theory aligns somewhat with statistics. A similar crime spike was observed from 1935 to 1950, when a generation raised by World War I veterans came of age. Another popular theory attributes the crime surge to environmental pollution, not global warming or coal dust, but something more serious. In the 20s, lead was added to motor fuel for quieter and more efficient engine performance. By mid-century, all of America was breathing leaded gasoline fumes. Numerous studies show how excess lead in the body lowers intelligence and can trigger aggressive behavior, especially damaging children's psyches and hindering development. Mass lead poisoning could have produced a generation prone to violence. Changes in the perception of sex might have also contributed. The time saw a boom in erotic content in popular culture. What censors previously banned became widely available. Playboy magazine's circulation increased sevenfold during the 60s, and by the 70s, a quarter of all American male students read it. The rise of the mass pornography industry marked the 70s, despite attempts to ban it. Explicit films competed with mainstream cinema at the box office, shown in regular theaters, as depicted in Martin Scorsese's Taxi Driver. They were discussed on TV, on major channels, and celebrities attended premieres. The film Deep Throat, released in 1972, reportedly grossed over $100 million. Critics claimed that porn dehumanized women, turning them into objects for pleasure to be treated however one wanted. Simultaneously, the true crime genre, combining sex with violence, grew in popularity. True crime magazines explicitly described sex crimes. Bundy later confessed that violent pornography strongly influenced him, but attributing all the responsibility for the violent spike to films and books is naive. Social changes and liberation likely provoked psychopaths. For some, it was a time of free love and independence. For others, it unleashed long-repressed demons. People also began moving faster and more easily thanks to the development of interstate highways. Hitchhikers, including women, became more common and weren't afraid to travel alone. Potential killers found it easier to find victims and change crime scenes. Police struggled to keep up. Remember, it was the mid-70s. No DNA analysis, ubiquitous surveillance cameras, mobile phones, or even basic fax machines in many places. Landline phones and traditional mail were the main communication methods, and data exchange between police departments was incredibly slow. Often, detectives investigating murders in the same series didn't know what their colleagues were doing in the next city, let alone another state. Bundy, deep within the system on the governor's Crime Prevention Commission, understood these issues and figured out how to rape and kill without getting caught.
It wouldn't be fair to say the police completely ignored Bundy after the series of abductions in Washington. In fact, homicide detectives were tailing Ted's car in Seattle, seemingly hoping to catch him in the act. At that point, though, they hadn't even questioned him yet. Strangely enough, the detectives brought a journalist along for the ride, who sat in the back seat during their stakeouts. According to his accounts, they spent countless nights parked in the car, watching, waiting, but nothing suspicious ever happened. Bundy seemed to sense that he'd left too many traces back in his home state, so he decided to move to Utah, where no one yet knew anything about the suspicious Ted driving a VW Beetle. 14 hours by car, it felt like a clean slate. Officially, he told his friends he was going to continue studying law, but in reality, he simply continued to rape and kill. Starting in the fall of 1974, young women began disappearing in Utah. Some bodies were found relatively quickly, like the 17-year-old daughter of a sheriff from one of the Salt Lake City suburbs. It would later come to light that Bundy had beaten her, raped her, and strangled her with nylon stockings. Another victim vanished in circumstances eerily similar to a case in Seattle. She disappeared into thin air, last seen walking from an elevator to her hotel room in a Colorado resort town. Meanwhile, remains of missing students were being found in Washington. When Bundy's girlfriend heard about the string of kidnappings in Utah, she contacted the police again. She had been persistently reporting her suspicions, but the cops just wanted to brush her off. At one point, they nearly shouted at her, "We already checked your boyfriend. He has nothing to do with it. Now go away." They weren't lying about the check. Bundy's photo had indeed been shown to witnesses of the Lake Sammamish abductions, where he had lured 2 girls from the beach within hours. Now, pay attention. 7 out of 8 witnesses failed to identify him. Bundy's girlfriend knew he had moved to Utah, but even there, the authorities showed little interest. She tried to reach the detectives through her father, who had connections in the police, but he too dismissed her, saying, "Why ruin a good guy's career with your suspicions?" Everything seemed to be in Bundy's favor, but then he slipped up. In November 1974, Bundy attempted to abduct 18-year-old Carol DeRanch from a shopping center in a suburb of Salt Lake City. He posed as a police officer and asked her to come with him to the station, claiming someone had tried to steal her car. Once in his Beetle, he pointed a gun at her and tried to handcuff her to the door. However, DeRanch managed to fight him off and escape. Bundy was furious about the failure and wanted to compensate quickly. That same evening, in a nearby town, he abducted a 17-year-old student. Her remains were identified only in 2015. Over the next 2 years, Bundy killed at least 17 innocent girls across Colorado, Utah, and Idaho, and showed no signs of stopping. It seemed like the failed abduction could be forgotten, but it came back to haunt him. In August 1975, Ted was driving around another Salt Lake City suburb, looking for a new victim. The highway patrol stopped him. Initially, Bundy didn't stop and tried to speed away, but eventually pulled over. Naturally, his behavior raised suspicions. The police thoroughly searched his car, expecting to find a first aid kit, but instead discovered a killer's toolkit: a ski mask, another mask made from pantyhose, a crowbar, handcuffs, rope, an ice pick, and other suspicious items initially thought to be burglary tools. Bundy tried to explain everything as ordinary household items. Masks were for skiing, the mountains were nearby, and the ice pick was for climbing. But the police weren't convinced by the image of a guy planning to ski on a green slope in August wearing a mask made from woman's pantyhose. More importantly, they remembered the November story about a suspicious guy in a Beetle trying to abduct a girl by posing as a cop. After a few months of bureaucratic delays, they finally conducted an identification lineup, and Carol DeRanch pointed at Bundy. But there was more. In Ted's apartment, they found a guide to Colorado resorts with a mark next to the hotel where one of the victims disappeared, and a brochure advertising a school play, after which another girl vanished. They also found the girl's hair in Bundy's car. The net was closing around Ted. The police remembered his girlfriend, who then revealed details about the plaster casts, knives, and women's clothing she had found. It turned out that Bundy wasn't home on the nights the students disappeared in Washington. Finally, detectives from Washington, Utah, and Colorado met. At their summit, they weighed the evidence and concluded that Ted Bundy likely committed all these murders. However, gathering solid evidence took time. So Bundy was initially charged with assault and attempted kidnapping, which was easier to prove. Interestingly, before the trial, while out on bail, Bundy lived with his girlfriend, the same woman who had repeatedly called the police. Even after her worst suspicions were almost fully confirmed, she still let the suspected maniac into her home and allowed her daughter to continue interacting with him. Deep down, she hoped it was all a mistake and that Bundy would be exonerated. And she wasn't the only one. There was almost a public campaign to defend Bundy. Friends, acquaintances, former professors, everyone tried to support him. The Mormons were particularly outraged. Between murders, Bundy had prudently joined their ranks. They drew touching pictures showing themselves holding hands with Ted. Look at his wide smile. Once again, Bundy's incredible ability to charm both his victims and the public was evident. Carol Duranch, the main witness for the prosecution, later recounted how even her friends doubted her testimony. "Are you sure it was him who pointed the gun at you in the Beetle and threatened to blow your head off? Are you sure you didn't mistake him for someone else?" But this charade didn't impress the judge. Bundy was found guilty of kidnapping and sentenced to 1 to 15 years. It's a tricky American system where you could serve a very short or very long time. But after that, he was charged with the murder of a girl who disappeared in Colorado. Everyone was confident that now the maniac, who by then was considered one of America's most vicious killers, would be permanently isolated from society. But then our story took a completely unexpected turn. Police work was tough then, as it always is. There were technical limitations, but human error, or plain negligence, played a crucial role. Imagine a person convicted of assault and attempted kidnapping, also accused of first-degree murder, and suspected of other heinous crimes. On top of that, Bundy had been caught preparing to escape while serving his sentence for the failed kidnapping. Such a record warranted multiple life sentences, if not several death penalties. Yet, this man was allowed to roam the courthouse in Aspen, Colorado, without handcuffs, because he had volunteered to defend himself. He was given access to the courthouse library to prepare for his trial, where he was barely supervised. During a break in one of the sessions, he jumped out of a second-story window and fled. Bundy wandered the surrounding mountains for 6 days before returning to the city, where he was arrested again for suspicious driving. He had barely slept and couldn't control the stolen car, which swerved side to side. You'd think after such antics, they'd guard him like Fort Knox, but once again, the police managed to outdo themselves. Bundy managed to raise money from sympathetic acquaintances, bought a hacksaw from other inmates, and cut a small hole in his cell's ceiling. During his preparations, he lost 35 pounds. Informants reported Bundy's suspicious activity to prison officials, but they ignored it. On New Year's Eve 1978, when most guards were home celebrating, Bundy squeezed through the hole, reached the warden's living quarters, changed into his clothes, and walked out of the maximum security facility. He wasn't missed until nearly 24 hours later, when he was already almost across the country. Holidays are sacred, after all. In early January, Bundy showed up in Tallahassee, the capital of Florida. Driving from Utah takes about a day and a half, and tracing Bundy's route from Seattle to Florida creates a diagonal line across the country. Tallahassee was warm, cozy, and offered the freedom he hadn't felt in a year of courtrooms and prisons. Bundy planned to start a new life under an assumed name, having learned to steal credit cards and not worrying about money. But it didn't work out, and he returned to his old ways. On the evening of January 14, 1978, he entered a bar, met a couple of girls, drank, and things escalated as they had in the past. Early on the 15th, Bundy entered a Florida State University sorority house through an unlocked back door. He attacked 4 students, raping and strangling 2, and severely injuring the others. He fractured their skulls, broke jaws, and crushed fingers with a wooden log. This all happened within 15 minutes. Then Bundy broke into another house on campus, where he brutalized another student. She survived thanks to her waking neighbors, but she lost some of her hearing. 2 weeks after the Tallahassee massacre, Bundy abducted, raped, and slit the throat of a 12-year-old girl in Lake City, near the Georgia border. Her mummified remains were found 7 weeks later in a pigsty. She became the last of at least 30 victims of one of America's most vicious killers. Here are photos of all the girls Ted Bundy killed. A week later, he was arrested for the 3rd time, once again by accident, during a car check. Bundy was driving around Florida in a stolen Volkswagen Beetle, a man who didn't change his habits or favorite brands. For the first few days after his arrest, Bundy concealed his identity but eventually confessed. He was charged with 3 murders in Florida, and these cases would later result in his death sentence. It's remarkable that Bundy was executed for a murder that could have been prevented. The lack of computers, databases, and modern technology wasn't the issue. 3 people, including a very young girl, died due to the outright negligence of police and prison guards. And once again, many of Bundy's victims were students. 1/3 of his victims were college or university students at the time of their deaths. Campuses became his favorite hunting ground. Bundy seemed to be subconsciously trying to destroy one of the symbols of the era, the image of young, ambitious women striving to get an education and build a career.
In the 1970s, America, like other Western countries, was engulfed by the second wave of feminism. The right to vote, won by suffragists, was no longer enough. There was a reassessment of the traditional image of women, the typical housewife whose main duty was to raise children and wait for her husband at home with a cooked dinner. This image had become entrenched during the post-war economic boom and baby boom, but it deeply frustrated the new generation of American women. Activist demands coincided with the interests of pharmaceutical giants. The sexual revolution of the 1960s is well known, but less obvious, yet more significant, was the revolution in contraception. Hormonal birth control pills, referred to simply as the pill, were much safer and more convenient than previous methods. Their popularity soared. By 1967, over 1 million American women were regularly taking them, and by 1972, they graced the cover of Time magazine. In 1972, the Supreme Court ruled against laws that prohibited the distribution of contraceptives to unmarried people, normalizing premarital sex. Pleasure became a priority. Another landmark legalization occurred in 1973 with the Roe v. Wade decision, recognizing abortion as a constitutional right. Prior to this, abortions were regulated at the state level, with bans in 30 states and severe restrictions in 16 others. The ruling allowed any American woman to have an abortion until the fetus became viable, a right upheld until 2022. These changes drastically increased the number of female students and graduates, with women increasingly entering fields traditionally seen as male-dominated. For instance, the number of women in law and medical schools tripled and increased 9-fold, respectively, in the 1970s. Bundy's victims included students studying political science and journalism. University campuses, filled with young, attractive women who felt safe, became ideal hunting grounds for Bundy. These women weren't hitchhiking or sleeping in train stations. They were surrounded by peers, seemingly in a secure environment.
Many films and books portray Bundy as a highly intelligent, cunning, and meticulous killer who outwitted the police for years, almost a demiurge among maniacs. But let's look at the facts. He introduced himself with his real name when approaching future victims, and his method of using a fake injury to gain sympathy was memorable and easily recalled by witnesses. Despite the effectiveness, it made him conspicuous. His girlfriend's report to the police, after finding a plaster cast, further illustrates his lack of prudence. Even the claim that Bundy was hard to catch because he left no fingerprints is misleading. He left plenty of traces and did little to hide his activities. For instance, after the failed kidnapping in Utah, he continued to drive the same Beetle, knowing full well that a witness could identify both him and the car. The Beetle contained hair evidence linking him to the victims. Bundy's movements were also traceable through his credit card usage at gas stations, clearly marking his presence near the disappearance sites. Bundy seemed to be daring the authorities to catch him, leaving clues as if playing a game of catch me if you can. Bundy often drank before committing his crimes, later admitting that it helped him overcome internal prohibitions and taboos. But it also affected his control over situations. His intoxicated state likely contributed to his failure during the attempted kidnapping in Utah. In Florida, in a drunken haze, he even bit one of his victims, leaving clear evidence. His 3 arrests were also due to his erratic driving, which drew police attention. He may not have left fingerprints, but his suspicious behavior made him noticeable. Let's just say, he was no Hannibal Lecter. Another story entirely is Bundy's behavior after his arrests. He was sentenced to 1 to 15 years for kidnapping, theoretically allowing him to be released in a year. Although he could have faced murder charges in Colorado, The evidence wasn't solid at that time, making the outcome uncertain. Yet, Bundy attempted 2 escapes and made no effort to lay low afterward. After his second escape, he didn't last even a month. Again, this seems illogical from a rational perspective, but Bundy lived in his own universe. He thrived on the thrill of skating on thin ice and was dangerously overconfident. This was evident during his Florida trial. Bundy could have avoided the death penalty by accepting a plea deal for a 75-year sentence. The authorities likely wanted to avoid a media circus or feared insufficient evidence to convince the jury. For Bundy, this wasn't the worst option. At 33, a 75-year sentence effectively meant life, but it wasn't the electric chair, and there was some hope for a retrial decades later. If he had acted more rationally, Bundy might have eventually been released. But he refused the deal, deciding to defend himself again, expressing distrust of his lawyer who agreed to the plea deal. While there were still court-appointed lawyers, Bundy made key decisions himself. During the trial, Bundy, supposedly studying law, effectively dug his own grave. One situation stands out. His lawyers were dismantling the prosecution's key witness, a girl who claimed to have seen Bundy leaving the campus after the murders. Under cross-examination, she faltered, and the prosecutors realized their case might fall apart. But then Bundy stood up and berated his own lawyers, driven by jealousy and a desire to control his case. He couldn't stand losing control, even if it cost him everything. In another instance, Bundy conducted the cross-examination of a police officer who found the students' bodies, forcing him to describe the crime scene in gruesome detail. The jurors heard about the girls' postures, injuries, blood trails, and broken limbs, painting a monstrous image of Bundy. Typically, the prosecution uses this tactic, but here, Bundy did their job for them. It seemed like Bundy used the trial to mentally revisit his crimes, reliving those moments he constantly replayed in his mind. He enjoyed playing the role of a lawyer, interacting with evidence and witnesses, a simulation of the career he never had. And he did all this knowing millions of viewers were watching.
The spike in serial killings from the 60s to the 80s is often linked to media influence. The media turned serial killers into celebrities like Elvis Presley, Sean Connery, or Madonna. Aspiring psychopaths saw how their idols gained fame, potentially pushing them from fantasy to reality. With media growth came the true crime genre. The 70s in America would later be called the golden age of serial killers, becoming as iconic as the Vietnam War, student riots, or Watergate. Journalists made Ted Bundy a cult figure. Even in prison, he spoke with journalists at least 5 times, and some won Emmys for their interviews. This isn't to mention the numerous books, films, and hundreds of millions of YouTube views his interviews garnered. Here are a few of his quotes. "I'm so ashamed to be on all the news today, but do I deserve it?" Or, "Today, many children are playing on the streets who will die tomorrow." Or, "Society deserves protection from itself." These are pretentious boasts from a man reveling in his media presence. Television played a crucial role in popularizing crime, allowing people to see monsters in real time, and Bundy excelled in front of the camera. Bundy looked great on camera, smiling and joking. The camera loved him, as TV people say. Plus, his story was captivating. A young, handsome man in an elegant gray suit, seemingly nothing like a killer, accused of monstrous crimes, all while claiming he was framed by the police. Was he a monster in sheep's clothing or a victim of injustice? This dramatic line was perfect. Bundy's fame began during his first trial for kidnapping, when a female journalist from conservative Utah interviewed him, later regretting how she smiled to win his favor. Bundy had special relationships with reporters, recognizing some and greeting them personally when escorted through the courthouse, saying things like, "Hi John, how are you? How's the family?" After his third arrest in Florida, Bundy solidified his star status. This was the first trial widely televised by major American networks. Foreign journalists were also present, with over 250 reporters covering the trial. The courthouse became a giant news department. Bundy enjoyed the media frenzy, seemingly doing things to ensure camera coverage, reveling in the attention. In court, many unrelated spectators, especially women, came to see him. They were drawn to the opportunity to be near a notorious maniac, but in a controlled, safe environment, experiencing a thrill like no other. Some even tried passing him notes through lawyers. This was more exciting than any thriller or horror movie, and free to watch. It's reminiscent of the crowds that gathered at Jack the Ripper's crime scenes a century earlier. Among the crowd was his former colleague, Carol Boone, who followed Bundy from trial to trial, smiling and looking devotedly at him while testifying in his defense. She essentially became his PR agent, actively defending him to journalists and eventually marrying him in court. The marriage was legal under Florida law since it happened before a judge. They might have hoped to sway the jury with this gesture, but on the same day, Bundy received his third death sentence unanimously. But even on his long walk to the Green Mile, Bundy still managed to cause trouble.
Even on death row, Bundy's life had twists. Despite being in maximum security, he managed to father a daughter. Conjugal visits were forbidden, but guards were bribed to look the other way. His wife, Carol Boone, later sent Christmas cards signed by her, Ted, and their daughter, even including the dog's paw print, trying to create an image of a normal family. Part of their PR strategy involved interviews with journalists, but Bundy's narcissism overshadowed it. He boasted about his murders, speaking in the third person to avoid legal trouble, but it was clear. His need for significance and attention outweighed rationality. FBI profilers also visited Bundy. The trend of creating psychological profiles of killers gained traction in the late 70s, leading to the establishment of a behavioral analysis unit. Early profilers traveled to prisons, interviewing serial killers to understand their mindset. Bundy had regular conversations with an agent who later rose to a senior FBI position. Before his execution, Bundy shared confessions, helped draft his will, and wrote farewell letters to relatives. He confessed his fear of death and his desire to deprive the state of the pleasure of executing him. Their conversations inspired a 2021 film starring Elijah Wood as the profiler. A day before his execution, Bundy gave an interview to a writer-evangelist known for fighting sexual content and media violence. Bundy claimed violent pornography drove him to murder, starting with true crime magazines he read as a teen, eventually reenacting scenes from them with his victims. He didn't mention this to others, likely manipulating the evangelist for more attention. Bundy often claimed to have had a normal childhood, mocking those who sought childhood traumas as an explanation for his brutality. Neighbors recalled young Ted tormenting cats and scaring peers, while his aunt once woke surrounded by knives placed by a smiling 3-year-old Ted. These were clear early signs. Usually, people like Bundy are withdrawn in childhood, becoming victims of bullying, and later seeking revenge for school grievances. This wasn't Bundy's case. He wasn't the life of the party or popular with girls, but wasn't a bullied outcast either. Reliable sources confirm Bundy's passion for theft from a young age. He was caught breaking and entering and attempting to steal cars as a teen. He also spied on neighbors through their windows while they were changing. At some point, these two compulsions may have merged. In essence, he treated his victims as objects. Violence and murder, according to his own words, were perceived by him as the highest form of possession, hence the elements of necrophilia. Bundy confessed that he not only returned to his crime scenes, but also spent time near his victims. He would wash their hair, apply makeup, and paint their nails, as if caring for his possessions. Where did such a fracture in his psyche come from?
Some doctors attribute Bundy's behavior to a difficult relationship with his mother. He was born in a home for unwed mothers in 1946, when having children out of wedlock was stigmatized. Most babies were taken from such homes and placed in full families, but Bundy's mother kept him, perhaps influenced by her parents. Initially, they passed Ted off as their son, while his mother was forced to act as his older sister. There was a horrific rumor that Bundy's grandfather was his biological father. DNA tests later disproved this, but his grandfather was still a dubious character. Some relatives described him as a psychopathic animal abuser who talked to invisible entities, while others saw nothing strange. Another potential trauma was Bundy's sense of inferiority and anger upon learning about his origins. But how serious this was is unclear. Bundy often mocked this theory. There's a belief that Bundy chose victims resembling a college crush who broke his heart. They were young, attractive women with long hair parted in the middle. But after she broke up with him, Bundy pursued her again, even getting engaged before disappearing from her life. This suggests he wanted to assert his power and seek revenge. She was another status symbol for him, like his car, suit, and presidential campaign work. There's confusion about Bundy's total number of victims. Before his execution, he confessed to at least 30 murders in 7 states. However, he sometimes hinted there were more, even suggesting over 100. He claimed his first murder was as a teenager. Lawyers, journalists, investigators, FBI agents, psychiatrists, and priests all left interactions with Bundy with different information. He tried to delay his execution by manipulating details of where victims were buried, a common tactic among serial killers to buy time. This tactic is called bones for time. At one point, a defense lawyer proposed that relatives of the missing girls file a petition to postpone Bundy's execution in exchange for information about the burial sites. And at the end of January 1989, 4 days after George H.W. Bush became the new president of the United States, after 9 years of delays and appeals, Bundy, who had been caught back when Jimmy Carter was in office, was sent to the electric chair. Bundy's execution turned into a spectacle of its own. A tent city sprang up outside the prison as nearly 2,000 people gathered to celebrate the killer's death. They sang songs about Bundy being fried like a potato and proudly wore electric chairpins. The media covered the entire circus extensively. After news of Bundy's death broke, the cheering crowd set off fireworks into the sky. At the same time, his execution came as a shock to many of his fans, who had been writing to him while he was on death row. Even his confession to murdering 30 women didn't change their devotion. His death marked the end of one of the most notorious chapters in American criminal history, but his story continues to intrigue and horrify people to this day. You might be surprised to learn that on TikTok alone, videos under the hashtag Ted Bundy have amassed nearly 2 billion views, and many of these videos are shockingly flattering. Trendy music, dramatic courtroom shots, and constant hints at his supposed innocence. Bundy's greatest trick was his appearance. He wouldn't have achieved such infamy if he'd looked like some deranged outcast with a psychiatric record. Instead, Bundy was a werewolf in disguise, with thick hair, a fitted blazer, a charming smile, and a beige Volkswagen Beetle. He stabbed decent society right in the back, going after what was considered sacred. He shattered the image of the normal, successful 30-something American man, educated, with a budding career and a cozy home in the suburbs. In today's terms, Bundy struck at the very core values of American life. He exposed the chilling truth that behind the bow tie and the tweed jacket, there could be a backyard filled with crowbars and nooses. When the truth came out, his acquaintances weren't just shocked, they felt deceived. These were people who would have trusted him with their daughters, their sisters, and he made fools of them. Another key factor was the social status of his victims, mostly white, middle-class girls from good families. They were relatable, familiar, part of the same world. That's why Bundy was often called an imposter, a man who, in truth, had never achieved anything real in life. It was a natural defense mechanism. People didn't want to admit that, in many ways, Bundy was just like them, that he was exactly the same as everyone else. Because if that were true, then who could you trust anymore? Not even yourself. Not even people from your own class. It was a serious blow to the familiar picture of the world. Bundy once said that society wants to believe it can spot evil and dangerous individuals, but it can't. He called himself the most ordinary man, and honestly, it's hard to tell what disturbed the public more: the horrific murders or the fact that the killer turned out to be a false hero. He mimicked a normal life, and that's why people trusted him. Perhaps that's the most important lesson from the story of Theodore Robert Bundy. This was the first episode of Serial Files. See you soon.